All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jaap Vos. I'm the director of the School of Urban Regional Planning. Welcome to the beginning of our fall lecture series. I started thinking about this, and we started our lecture series, I believe, in the fall of 2003. And it was that time, it was called the Second Wednesday Lecture Series. We did that, the focus of that lecture series was on excellence in planning. Right? The idea was I became chair, and I wanted to do something that was about excellence in planning. Next series, the year afterward, was about planning visionaries. And they were wonderful lectures, and they were wonderful presentations, but we made one big mistake, and that is that we never followed up. And they remained interesting lectures, but nothing ever happened. We went back to business as usual. And it seems that we've come full circle. I think we need to talk again about planning excellence, and we need to talk about innovation. And I hope that we as a school have learned something about this. I hope that we have learned to do it better, to follow up. The one thing that we've learned is to now do webcast. It used to be that everybody was just here, now we're webcasting it. And I forgot my computer, which they're fixing. But last time when we did this with the Delta Commissioner, we had about 50 people online watching it. The time when we did it before with the Truth About Florida, we had 100 people watching it online. So even though the room is not full, no, it's not a bad crowd, I'm anticipating that there will be quite some people online. And I hope that this time they will ask more questions online. So we decided this year to organize a lecture series about what planning in Florida should and could be all about. We have invited speakers that we hope will stimulate a discussion about where we can go with planning. And we have learned, we're webcasting everything. So the intent of the series is to start a discussion about planning. And today we're going to start with a presentation by former DCA Secretary Tom Pelham, and what I hope will be a candid reflection on Florida's planning system and what it did and what it didn't do well. On October 17, we will have Robert Yarrow. We've tried to get him for a long time, and with Charlie's help, we finally have him. The president of the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut Regional Plan Association to talk about regional planning. We will hopefully, by that time, be able to confirm the dates for Alan Thierstein from the University of Munich, who is going to talk, we hope he's going to talk about, I'm going to write this down exactly, adding value to spatial development. Adding value to spatial development. And then we have Will Sonneveld from the University of Delft, and also the Research Institute in Delft, and we've asked him to talk about visioning and visualizing. So as you can see, we've invited speakers that can talk about different ways of looking at planning, different models of planning. And I think if you really look at the lecture series, and if you look at the speakers, go online and you can read about it, you will see that there is a strong bias, I think, in these lectures. And the bias is towards a regional approach based on economic competitiveness. I think that's really where we're going with it. Charlie and I did a class this summer. I think that's where we were coming from at the end. I know we have regional planning councils. I'm not sure that they are equipped to do the things that we think they need to do. In addition, I think that there seems to be a lack of understanding of what these regions are all about. We do design and we think about it, but we really don't understand how these regions work, what is important, what the interconnections are in the region, and what the connections are outside of the region. So finally, I think the presenters that we've chosen show a bias towards graphical representation of planning. And I think that is because I think planners have been unsuccessful in communicating ideas and concept to both elected officials and citizens. And I think if we want to be successful, we need to be able to communicate better. And one way to do that is by maps. And in the summer class, we showed some maps, and I think they opened some eyes of people and said, I had never thought about that. Hey, this is really clear all of a sudden. So, the other thing we have learned from the past is that we need to follow up. So this year, after a thought-provoking series of lectures, we will conclude with a presentation by Charlie Seaman. He is the newly appointed John M. DeGrove Eminent Scholar Chair in Growth Management and Development, which is a very unfortunate title. But I think he can step in the chair in steps of John DeGrove, and it's going to help us thinking more about planning in Florida. He is charged with what we have for now called, Charlie's going like, oh, don't tell this to everybody, a call for action. So based on these lectures, what we hope will come out of this is a call for action, a call for how we can do planning differently. And what I hope will also become clear is what the role is of the university. Because as a university, we typically stand on the sideline and we've kind of taught all your students about what planning is all about, but we've never played an active role, and I think it is time to rethink our role. So, Charlie cannot do that by himself, so we need your input, we need your ideas, so please feel free to comment during the lectures, but also to send your comments. I will give you my email, I'm sure Charlie has an email, and let us know what you think about and where we need to go with this. It really needs to work with everybody. We can't just do it this small group. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Charlie Seaman. I met Charlie about 3 years ago, and I was introduced to him by a lunch that was arranged by Peter Henn, our now first developer in residence. And since that time, Charlie and I have been having these wonderful lunch discussions about what planning is, what planning ought to be. And it didn't dawn to me until this summer that I should ask him to become the eminent scholar chair in growth management and planning. So I can read Charlie's resume, and you know I hate doing that, and I'm sure you all hate listening to people's resumes, so I simply refer you to our webpage. It's all on there. What I do want to say is that I always really look forward to our lunches. They're always thought-provoking, they're never boring, and they always lead to more work. I look forward to working with Charlie on this rethinking of Florida. I mean, I really think that there's an opportunity. I think we have a fairly small period of time that we can do this. So I look forward to it, and please help me in welcoming Charlie Seaman. I have one question that I forgot. Please turn off your cell phones. It really reflects best with the camera and the microphones. Thanks.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and the first thing I want to say is that it's a personal privilege of mine to have this appointment. I had the great pleasure of knowing John DeGrove and working with him in a number of circumstances, not the least of which is the Florida Keys area of critical state concern. He and I conspired against the Water Management District to try to bring some interrelationship and organization between land management and water management. I had the great pleasure in my career of working not just in Florida but around the country, and I think John appreciated the perspective that I could bring to our conversations in various circumstances. And so I'm really pleased, and it is my intent to ask the hard questions about rethinking planning in Florida. And I have a great, profound sense of personal disappointment because I was there at the beginning and literally working as a research clerk for the First Elms Committee, and that's in fact where I met Fred Bosselman and Dick Babcock and ended up with my career. But looking back, I wonder how we could have made things better, and that's part of what I hope we'll be able to do during the term that I am this eminent chair. We had a wonderful summer course, and I thought I had designed this very clever curriculum that would lead us first from the history of American planning, then through various aspects that would lead the students to discuss in the last section what do we really need to do, what do we need to change. And about the third lecture, it was over. They had the answer. They were already not thinking about the past but looking to the future and really challenging us. But it gave me hope that we can design through this process, through part of my research and writing that I'm doing this fall, which will be the basis for my last lecture, some provocative ideas about how we can think differently. David just asked me what was the outcome of the class, and I said it was Einstein's rule prevailed. And you know, Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, that we'll do a better job. And I think part of what we discovered was while the ideas were better each time, they then went through a process of political bastardization and financial suppression and self-interest that really stripped away the opportunity to really do a better job. And so we got the same result in each of these generations of trying to improve it. And so I'm not trying to replace it, but I'm trying to augment it. And I spent most of my career in Chicago. I am a great fan of the Chicago plan, and it was prepared not by a city government. It was never part of a regulation. It was an aspirational plan that says Chicago needs to be a great city. And it provided the foundation for that. And most of it came from implementation by private sector initiative. And I think that's something that we've really lost in what we've done in Florida. It's been almost antagonistic and adversarial. So that's what I hope, and I give you this brief overlook because I really hope that you all will engage in it, because I intend to make this as much as I can a worthwhile endeavor and to produce something that will really have a basis for thinking. I don't need to introduce Tom. I've known Tom a long time. You all know who he is, but there is just nobody better to give the first lecture on reflecting on planning in Florida. He's been there in every way. He's been a private sector consultant representing both sides of the table in all parts of the state. I've had an opportunity to work with him. I've had an opportunity to work on the other side of him, but he really knows it. He's been an author. He's contributed to the literature, both in a number of contexts. He's been a professor who's taught growth management law in law school, and he was the secretary of the Department of Community Affairs, not once, but twice. And for that, Tom, we're grateful for your service and really appreciate you being here and look forward to your lecture. Tom Pelham.
Good afternoon. I think it's still afternoon, shortly to be evening. Thank you, Charlie, for the very generous introduction, but more importantly, thank you for the generous introduction, but more importantly, congratulations to you and to Florida Atlantic for your appointment as to the John DeGrove Eminent Chair. I can't think of anyone more deserving, and I know that John DeGrove would be delighted. Charlie and I have enjoyed numerous encounters over the years, always enjoyable, always professional, always enlightening. I want to thank Professor Voss, Charlie, and the university for the honor and the opportunity of being the opening act in what sounds like a very exciting lecture series, and a very timely one, because I think a rethinking of Florida's planning system is very much in order, especially following what I consider to be an outright disaster in the 2011 legislative session. I do understand that this is being webcast or broadcast or whatever, and I'll try to keep my candor to respectable levels. But honesty always has to trump other considerations. A few caveats at the beginning. I am not an attached, not an objective, detached observer who's been sitting on the sidelines with a dispassionate eye watching what's going on with no interest. I have been a participant and a combatant from the beginning until now, and I do have strongly held views about a lot of these things. As a planner, I remain undaunted by the obstacles to sound planning, and I believe planning can help us attain a better society. And as a lawyer, I have a great belief and faith in the transformative power of the law. And I don't think we should ever give up. We always have to persevere. We always have to have our eye on the future, but it's always important to look to the past, because as intelligent people, and certainly as planners, we should try to learn from the past. Reflecting on Florida's planning system. It probably deserves several different books after 25 years. There's a lot to reflect on. I'd like to begin by setting the stage for the 1985 Florida legislature. At that time, Florida had a huge growth rate, 300,000 new residents net per year, and that's the rate the state had been experiencing since the 1950s. As a result, Florida had huge infrastructure deficits, estimated in 1985 to be on the order of $50 billion because infrastructure wasn't something the state had paid any attention to. The Local Government Planning Act of 1975 had been a failure. After 10 years, with that law on the books, a law that didn't require binding state review, that lacked a lot of the teeth that went into the 1985 Act. Many local governments still had not adopted a local plan, and many of those who had ignored it. The result, local governments in 1985, not to mention the state itself, was ill-equipped to deal with the growth and development that the state was experiencing. If you go back and read the statewide media at the time, not to mention numerous other sources, you will find that there was widespread concern about what the growth was doing to the state, how it was impacting our environment, our natural resources, and our quality of life. It is not surprising when you read all that had been going on in the few years preceding 1985 to understand why in that year the Florida legislature passed new comprehensive planning legislation on a scale really that was unprecedented in this country, especially for a state the size of Florida with such a dynamic and changing growth rate. The 1985 legislation, which came to be known as the Florida Growth Management Act, embodied in it a new state policy. Florida will plan to accommodate its growth in a well-planned manner. That was the sentiment, that was the policy, that's what the state said it was going to try to accomplish. And each level of government, local, regional, and state, was to be involved, recognizing that addressing our most important growth and development issues required the participation, the commitment of government at every level. The act required local governments to plan. They must adopt plans, and they had to be consistent with regional and state plans. And local governments were required to implement their plans through local regulations and development orders that were consistent with the adopted plan. And finally, land use decisions in the future were to be based on planning policies, not on politics. I think we all know, especially those of us who've been in the game for a long time, that you never remove politics from this business. But certainly the legislation has one of its goals that land use decisions be more rational in the future, that they be based on something more than head counts, that government planned before it regulated. Implementation of this landmark legislation was a very exciting thing to behold at the time. If you go back to 1986, 87, 88, those early years, there was a tremendous amount of excitement in the state. Not to say that there wasn't resistance, because there was, and ever so often I review my scrapbook from that time just to remind myself of the resistance. But there was a feeling that the state was going to take control of its destiny through planning for its future, that Florida was going to invest in its future. It was going to ensure that we had adequate infrastructure to serve the growth that we all assumed that would just continue forever. We were going to make Florida an even better place to live, work, and play. We were going to protect our environmental and natural resources. We empowered citizens so that they could participate more effectively through broad standing provisions. All in all, a Herculean task to consider the size of Florida, its growth rate, what this legislation proposed to do, actually, presented a monumental challenge. There were a lot of skeptics that much of anything would be accomplished because it was such a comprehensive, sweeping law, a very ambitious undertaking, to say the least. And resistance, yes. Many pockets, many areas in the state that didn't have any planning tradition at all, had no plan. Some didn't even have a simple subdivision regulation, not to mention the no zoning regulations. So this act, which purported aim to accomplish all that I've spelled out, was to be done in 4 short years. Every local government in the state, 470 of them, were to adopt plans, submit them for state approval in a phased-in 4-year period. Well, how well has this system worked? How did it work at the local level? And I'd like to discuss this in terms of the 3 levels, the 3 tiers of planning: the state plan, the state comprehensive plan at the top, regional planning in the middle, and at the base of the planning pyramid, local plans. Well, I think probably the most success was realized in these early stages at that local level. If nothing else, I think our experience has demonstrated the transformative power of the law. It changed the way planning was done in Florida. It changed the way land use decisions were made in Florida. It changed the ways that the courts reviewed local plans in Florida. And it accomplished one of the major objectives of the act, which was to have every local government equip itself with an adopted local plan and implementing regulations which it could use to deal with the overwhelming growth that the state was experiencing. By the end of the 4-year period, every local government, all 470 of them, had an adopted plan. Not every one of them had yet been found in compliance, but that followed in short order. Were these perfect plans? No. Were they good plans? Many weren't. But they were plans, and they were better than what many local governments had previously had. There are all kinds of anecdotes that you can tell about this process. On the issue of whether or not the plans were good, the one that always sticks in my mind is this one. Some regional planning councils contracted out with small local governments to prepare their plans for them, because at that time we had many small local governments that had no in-house planning staff, no in-house planning department, no in-house planning resources of any kind. So they would contract with outside consultants, and in a few cases they contracted with their regional planning council. One day one of our planners brought me in a plan from a jurisdiction that I'm not going to name, but it said, look here how they filled in the blank. It was a boilerplate plan that had blanks to be filled in depending upon which local government it was, and in this particular instance they had filled in the name of the wrong local government. So while we thought that we were reviewing the plan for local government A, it in fact was for local government B. Yes, there was some of those kinds of things. Probably not as much as you might have expected given the magnitude of the challenge and the short period of time in which it was to be accomplished. Nevertheless, whatever the flaws, this established a planning foundation in this state on which local governments can build. And I am reminded ever so often of just how excellent a few of those plans were. I worked with one in the last month, and during the course of that work, I was reminded that the department had given it the Best Plan of the Year award back in 1990. The plan was so good that it remains relatively intact today, and it has one of the most clearly articulated visions for a county plan that I have ever encountered in the state. A planning strategy that's spelled out in detail, that leaves no doubt about what the plan is trying to accomplish, and I think it would pass muster under whatever version or definition anyone would use of smart growth today. It was the exception. But my point is, this law brought planning into our state at the local level and changed the way planning was done. It also changed things in another way by giving plans the status of law. the consistency requirement. The requirement that local development orders and land development regulations had to be consistent with the adopted plan had a transformative impact. In the early years especially, Florida's judiciary strongly supported the Growth Management Act and its implementation, and that's reflected in a variety of ways. The courts developed the strict scrutiny standard. We, the courts, will closely scrutinize local development orders and the local plan to make sure that that local order is consistent with the plan, because the plan is now the constitution for land use in our state, and that's a term that the courts themselves used. The 1993 Snyder decision by the Florida Supreme Court transformed zoning law in this state. As a result of the consistency requirement, the local plan is now the paramount legislation, and zonings and rezonings, along with other development orders, which must be consistent with that legislative act, are now quasi-judicial actions, with the exception of some large-scale rezonings, which would remain quasi-judicial. That was a huge change in Florida land use law. It was controversial with many local governments, but they adjusted, they adapted. It's now an ingrained part of our system, for better or worse. Let me just make 2 or 3 concluding comments about the local level of this planning system. In my view, if you're going to have a plan, it needs to have the status of law. If it doesn't have the status of law, it will be ignored in the long run, as our 10-year experience with the 1975 Act illustrates. There may be situations where local governments can enter into agreements among themselves that are enforceable and create a system that they all agree to abide by. But on the whole, I personally believe that giving the plan the status of law was a necessary action, especially following our 10 years of failure. Policy planning. And under our act, plans are indeed policy plans for the most part, because they are required to set forth goals, objectives, and policies which become binding, have the force of law. What's the rationale behind that? Well, if government is going to regulate, shouldn't it regulate pursuant to articulated standards? If there are no articulated standards, you can't have meaningful judicial review. Judicial review under constitutional provisions, equal protection, due process, really is not a very meaningful level of review, as any land use lawyer who's litigated a lot of cases on those issues can tell you. But the plan, with its policies as law, are a way to hold local governments accountable for their decisions. It's a way of giving landowners and citizens notice of what it is that the local government is attempting to accomplish. As someone who has worked as a land use lawyer under the old system, that is in the 1970s, I can say that as far as I'm concerned, despite its flaws, the new system is a big improvement over the old system, and I'll take the new any day of the year rather than the old. There was, though, I think, a missing link in the local planning process that was established by the 1985 legislation. Why wasn't economic development considered important enough to have its place as a mandatory element in the local plan? It was not, for whatever reason. And although the Department of Community Affairs in those early years encouraged local governments to voluntarily adopt an economic development element and integrate it into their plan, very few did, and that remains the case today. And what is the result? Most local economic development initiatives, not to mention state initiatives, take place outside the local comprehensive planning process. And further, as a result, most local plans simply perpetuate the same old growth and development paradigm that Florida has lived with for years, namely based on population growth and residential rooftops. An omission that is even more glaring today than it was back then, because back then I suppose all we were thinking about is all the continuing growth of new people moving in and all the new houses that were going to be built. What about the new system at the regional level? Because as I pointed out earlier, the new legislation required that each of the state's 11 regional planning councils to adopt a comprehensive regional policy plan that translated state policy to the regional level. We will never know how that part of the system worked. Why? Because we never gave it a chance. We never implemented it. In 1993, the legislature, pursuant to recommendation of Governor Childs' Elms III Committee, decided to downsize regional plans and defang regional planning councils, that is, take away their powers, and it did it in a variety of ways. It took away the regional planning council's right to appeal local development of regional impact orders, prohibited regional planning councils for adopting level of service standards for infrastructure within the region, scaled down the comprehensive regional policy plans to make them strategic regional policy plans with a much narrower scope and content. And finally, a directive to DCA, the Department of Community Affairs, that you cannot find a local plan not in compliance with state law based solely on inconsistency with the regional plan. In other words, we substantially downgraded the role of the regional planning councils and regional planning, which was to be a very important part of this 1985 legislation. In my opinion, that was one of the most unfortunate developments in the history of the Act's implementation, because the result was that neither the Regional Planning Council nor regional plans, with a few exceptions, have played any significant role in the implementation of our growth management legislation. I think it has set back regional planning in the state for at least 20 years, because I think out of that could have evolved a stronger regional focus, a stronger regional system, stronger regional planning, and we simply lost it. We threw it away, and for 20 years we've been without it. I say that because I think Florida is a state of very distinct regions with distinct cultures, economies, traditions, geographies, topography, however you want to look at it. And on the other hand, we are in this state, we have a greatly fragmented government. Now 475 local governments, 13 or 1,500 special districts, a variety of regional agencies. There needs to be something to bridge all of those differences, better intergovernmental coordination. I think we lost a golden opportunity back in the early 1990s when we decided, before ever giving it a chance really, to downsize the regional level of this process. And I'll come back to this later in my concluding remarks. Finally, how did it work at the state level? Again, we'll never know, because Florida didn't stay the course with that top tier of planning either. The State Comprehensive Plan, which was a compromise, watered-down document, overly generalized, needed to be refined, reformed, developed, whatever term you want to use, but instead we let it stagnate. In its history, it's only been amended 2 or 3 times. It was used so rarely that it became the object of ridicule. Now, a creative, imaginative person or department could take that original comprehensive plan and make something out of it, and I believe we did in a few instances. But with the passage of time, it was simply neglected, and notwithstanding a clear, strong directive that the executive branch develop, prepare, adopt a growth management component of the state comp plan that would be far more specific and directive, that simply was never done. and several administrations came and went and simply never took on the duty or the challenge of doing that. At the same time, we saw the demise of the state agency functional plans. The original act said, we want state government operating off of the same sheet of music, and we want state executive agencies to be together on this. And each agency was to adopt its functional plan, which would spell out how it would achieve its mission consistent with the state comprehensive plan. There was an enormous amount of time, energy, and paper spent on preparing those original plans, but slowly but surely they faded away till in the early 2000s the legislature unlinked those plans from the state comp plan. They no longer even had to be consistent with the state comp plan, and I don't know if agencies are even doing them anymore. Next, there was a lack of support that gradually evolved over the history for the Department of Community Affairs and its state oversight role. Reduced staff, annual budget limitations, lack of public support, political support. It became a whipping boy. Now, all this agency was doing was implementing laws passed by the state legislature, and they were also subject to another law which says if you're caught implementing these new laws without first adopting rules, you will be subject to penalties. And yet it was the department that became the whipping boy for all this flood of regulations that kept coming out of the legislature year after year, imposing more and more mandates on local government without any resources to do them, and I might add, without any increased resources to the department, who was given substantial new planning responsibilities on several occasions. And then there was the failure to fund infrastructure so that concurrency might actually work in the way that it was envisioned by the original act, a problem that has haunted the process from start to finish, and I think is responsible for some of the actions that occur in Tallahassee that on their face seem very irrational, except I think they're motivated by a desire, hey, anything to keep from having to raise a new tax or raise any new revenues or invest in our state. So, we will never know how the 1985 integrated state, regional, and local planning system would have worked because as early as 1993, it began to disintegrate for the reasons and in the manner that I have described. In other words, it was never really given a chance. So what happened to what was left of the planning system, which is essentially the local planning process subject to review by the Department of Community Affairs of virtually every plan amendment adopted by local government in this state. To simply state that is to show how misguided the effort was. I mean, an enormous undertaking with limited resources which have to be wasted on reviewing the most minuscule plan amendments that occur in local governments on a regular basis. Well, the local planning system simply, the overall integrated planning system simply morphed into a local planning process with state oversight. How has it worked? How has that remnant of the original vision worked? I believe that DCA review has curbed some of the worst excesses that would have occurred at the local level in the absence of that system. I could go on for a long time with examples of ill-advised plan amendments shipped up to Tallahassee for state review. It boggled my mind at times, still does, at some of the proposals that still are being sent up to Tallahassee even today, 25 years after the act. I mean, wouldn't you think that in a coastal high hazard area that had been decimated by hurricanes 2 years in a row, as was Perdido Key in 2004 and 2005, that no one would seriously think about cramming thousands of new residential units into that coastal high hazard area? Well, we received that. We received all manner of proposals that purported to dredge 2-mile channels through Florida aquatic preserves, huge developments in marinas and prime manatee habitat, inland ports and power plants too close to the Florida Everglades. I mean, you could go on and on and on. And but for state review, but for the department, those things would have happened. They would have happened. These were plan amendments adopted by local governments. And they weren't cases of local governments saying, oh, we're not really serious about that. Let's run it up the flagpole and let DCA take the blame. These are cases where local governments were fighting, litigating to accomplish those amendments. I think this oversight role became even more important during the hometown democracy movement. You all know what that is, I'm assuming. And it set off a panic, a statewide panic in this state, as landowners, developers, and their consultants tried to get a plan amendment for virtually every acre of land in this state to circumvent the hometown democracy requirement, I exaggerate, in the event that it passed. And local governments were more than willing to accommodate them, even if they were plan amendments that would drive humongous holes through their existing plans. There was no way the Department of Community Affairs could find all of those plan amendments not in compliance, even though many of them deserved to be. With our limited staff, planning and legal, we had 4 lawyers. 2 major compliance cases would tie up our lawyers and a lot of our planners. There was simply no way. So what were we left to do? To try to minimize the damage, to make them as least harmful as possible. And I think that review function did that. But a lot of local plans in this state will never be the same as a result of what went on in the 4 years leading up to hometown democracy. Major damage was done to local plans, in my opinion, as a result of that. And another strange thing happened. Instead of being a planning process in which important fundamental threshold issues were addressed, it became an ordinary permitting process. Why? Because in order to get ill-advised amendments approved, what does the landowner do? Oh, well, what if I do this? Well, what if we put in this provision? What if we prohibit this? What if we provide for a 100-foot buffer around? You'd think you were in the development permitting process, not the planning process. And who's driving this? Not the local government, not the community. It's their plan. They're not driving this. Individual landowners intent on getting entitlements for their property are driving this with ill-advised plan amendments. We're a long way now from the planning system envisioned in the 1985 Act. Now, what else happened to this remnant that's left of the 1985 planning system? Well, starting in 2005, we began to get very erratic legislation out of the state legislature about every year. In 2005, the first Senate Bill 360 passed. Notwithstanding 2 recent legislative study committee final reports that said transportation concurrency needs to be made more flexible, we need to loosen it up, especially in urban areas. And notwithstanding another report which said concurrency will never work in the school system, school concurrency is a bad idea. Integrated, coordinated land use and school planning is important, but concurrency is not the way to get there. Notwithstanding their own legislative committee reports, the legislature suddenly mandated school concurrency, along with water concurrency, which may make a lot more sense, and tightened up transportation concurrency. 180 degrees from where we should be going and where its own legislative committee report, study commission report had indicated. So, when I became secretary for the second time in early 2007, what was the major point of contention? My God, we've got to correct Senate Bill 361. That's done major damage. There was a revolt going on all over the state. And so we got some legislation to address, kind of smooth out the rough edges. But one legislative leader in his wisdom thought, well, we really need to tack on something called expedited plan amendment review or alternative state review. And we're going to do it as a pilot program. And it will apply to all plan amendments, not to just, minor ones, all of them. So that gets tacked on at the last minute to the act. though not before the department said, we won't support it unless you keep the preponderance of the evidence burden of proof. If you make it fairly debatable, we're not going to support it. So they said, okay, we'll keep the preponderance of evidence. And they wanted to limit the department's review to facilities and resources that were state or regionally important. The department said, fine, but you need to define it. And if you're not going to define it, give us rulemaking authority to flesh it out. No. We don't want to give you any rulemaking authority. No, we don't want to define it. Well, then it's unworkable. Compromise on the last day of the session was to keep preponderance of the evidence and to say the department is encouraged to focus on facilities and resources. What happens the very next year, 2008? We get House Bill 697, stuck into an omnibus bill in the closing days of the session. Hardly anyone knew it. Local governments are now to amend their plans to do such things as reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to have more energy efficient development patterns, on and on. No definitions, no standards, no new resources, but lots of staff time spent by local governments in the state trying to figure out what this means and to implement it. And then what happens the very next year, 2009? Well, we suddenly do a 180-degree turn on transportation concurrency again. Having just tightened it up in 2005, now we want to abolish it in large areas of the state unless local governments, under their home rule power, decide to keep it. This erratic, almost irrational system, and that 4 or 5 year period, in my opinion, did major damage to this process. It highlighted the deficiencies of it. It strained it almost to the breaking point. It made DCA even more the whipping boy because we got blamed for all of these new requirements because we were the messenger. And all this time, at every step of the way, as the legislature imposed these new requirements, they reduced staff and reduced budget. Further undermining the whole system because the system begins losing credibility when you don't have resources to implement it in a responsible, rational fashion. So where did that leave us? Well, I often ask this question now. Whatever happened to ELMS Committee 5? We developed in this state a very sound tradition, in my opinion, of approaching these very important growth and development issues, these planning issues, by taking a very inclusive, participatory, deliberative review process. Governor Askew started it in the 70s with the first ELMS Committee. 10 years later, Governor Graham followed with ELMS 2 to go do a thorough review and build on what had been done, always trying to reach consensus, trying to build a strong base of stakeholder support. Governor Childs followed suit 10 years later in the early 90s. In the early 2001, Governor Bush followed suit. Now, Republicans couldn't be creating ELMS committees. That was a Democratic Party thing, so let's call it something different. It's just the Growth Management Study Commission. Nevertheless, it was a study commission, a year-long deliberative process, participatory, all major stakeholders involved. 2011 should have been the year for ELMS Committee 5, or whatever name the new Republican governor gave it. 10 years, this was the time. Instead, what did we get? We got the hastily enacted, poorly vetted, terribly drafted piece of special interest legislation put together by one stakeholder group, the development industry. And the law was written and rammed through the legislature by the Florida Chamber of Commerce, Associated Industries, the Florida Home Builders Association, the Association of Florida Community Developers. They wrote it before the session ever started and started telling everybody, hey, here it is. This is what it's going to be. You got any suggestions or anything you might want to add? You better get them in because this is it. And that's what passed under the name of the Community Planning Act, a misnomer if I ever heard one. It should be more accurately called the Local Planning Disarmament Act, because what it aims to do is to disarm local governments and undermine local planning. Is a plan that's not financially feasible, at least in its first 5 years with regard to infrastructure and capital improvements, a worthwhile plan? No, it's totally unrealistic. Throw it on the shelf and forget about it. Do you think, especially given our situation in Florida where we have over 1 million unoccupied built residential units, that the issue of need should at least be a factor in planning decisions? No, we're not going to consider need, get rid of it. Does transportation concurrency not work in urban areas? No, it really doesn't. Okay, let's get rid of it everywhere. Let's just abolish it. If local governments want to keep doing it, you can keep doing it, but here's the recipe you're going to follow. Lots of bennies for one stakeholder group. 2 guesses as to which one it was. Well, it was the one that wrote it to begin with. They've been trying to get the same legislation through the legislature for the last 4 years without success. Regime change, though, can change a lot of things. Here's, I don't know, I'm losing track of my time. But here's a little story that I think illustrates what's happened to our planning and growth management system in Tallahassee and has application more broadly to other areas. When the department was being pounded by the Florida Chamber of Commerce for various things, one of which was the adoption of a rule to govern the rural land stewardship area planning technique, under a statute that when it was enacted required the department to adopt rules, but the department never did. So when faced with the landowners owning over 1 million acres proposing to suddenly put new towns all over the heartland of Florida, the department decided it probably was better late than never, and so we initiated rulemaking. And of course we got pounded by various interests, including the Florida Chamber of Commerce. And when I went over to talk with them, I said, aren't there some things we could really work together on? I mean, what are the problems here? Well, Mr. Secretary, let me tell you what I hear from some of my board members. I hear, can't we get rid of the Department of Community Affairs? And if we can't do that, can't we get rid of its secretary? And I said, well, who are these board members? Well, a name was thrown out. And I said, well, that's interesting. I've never met that gentleman. To my knowledge, he never had any business with the department while I've been here. I don't even know who he is or what his concern would be. And the response was, well, Mr. Secretary, I'm not surprised that you don't know what he is or what he does. He is so good that when he acts, you're not even going to know he was involved. Now, I don't know how you would have taken that remark, but I know how I took the remark, and it did not alter the course we were on, but they got their revenge in the 2011 legislature because the Florida Chamber became a cover for those kind of groups and their agenda. And it pumped millions of dollars into local Republican legislative races. And as I read the newspapers throughout last fall, every time I picked up, it seemed that some Republican legislative candidate was saying that on his platform was the abolition of the Department of Community Affairs. Well, that's happened. And also, in my view, major damage to what's left of the planning legislation, because as I view and analyze this new legislation, it is nothing more than an effort to remove any requirement, standard, or consideration that would be a barrier, especially to development in rural areas. Urban sprawl, sort of gutted, need thrown out the window, doesn't have to be financially feasible. Local government can get rid of transportation concurrency. Put new towns wherever you want them. Local governments will have more discretion
more discretion to do bad planning. If you don't want a financially feasible plan, if you don't want to do transportation concurrency, if you don't want to consider need, if you don't want to comprehensively revise and evaluate your plan every 7 years, don't do it. It's an invitation to abandon fundamental principles of planning. Now we will see how much local governments have matured. Have they come far enough away that they can use their own independent judgment without a statutory requirement and do good planning? That remains to be seen. We can all hope that they will. Let me finally set the stage then, as I did in the beginning for the 1985 legislation, for 2011 and beyond. Florida now has a low growth rate, and it may not ever return to 1985 levels. We still have a huge infrastructure deficit because we still don't make any investments in our state to speak of, and concurrency certainly didn't solve that problem because of the way it was implemented over the years and without the necessary funding to make it work. All local governments now do have plans. We can hope they keep them. And they have implementing LDRs in place. State oversight has been effectively eliminated, and I predict that not much in the way of state oversight is going to happen. I'm told that not a single plan amendment has been found not in compliance from January 3rd of this year to the current day. I expect that that will continue to be the norm. There is now, unlike 1985, great antipathy toward government at all levels, and planning and regulations, replaced by ideology. And we find this antipathy especially in the state executive and legislative branches. There's no recognition, apparently, or appreciation that law and planning could actually improve our society. We're mired in an economic recession following the crash of the real estate market, and it may be years before we recover. Our government is more fragmented than ever. More local governments, more special districts, you name it. So, the plate that we currently have presents some real challenges. But I would say that it has been a tremendous educational process. We are better off now than we were in 1985. We should have learned enough to plan our way out of the situation. But will we? What will rise from the ashes? Well, I'll leave you with these thoughts. I don't think the answer is going to come from Tallahassee, and certainly not from the state legislature anytime soon. I think we need to look to local and regional initiatives. When I prepared for this, I remembered a short little piece that I wrote all the way back in 2001 called Restructuring Florida's Growth Management System, which suggested that we needed in the future to look to the regional level. That's where the key was in the future, and I believe that even more strongly today. But I don't think it will be regionalism that results from state statutes enacted by the state legislature. If we're going to achieve it, I think it will be regionalism through localism. Local governments getting together, uniting, identifying problems, working out solutions, organizing to protect themselves against the state, to protect themselves against special interest-driven limitations on local governments, because one of the alarming trends of the last 10 years has been an increase in state prohibition of local governments, state preemption of local governments, whether it's signs and billboards, security lights, guns, development in rural lands. DCA doesn't exist as the boogeyman anymore. Interestingly, the executive director of Associated Industries was quoted following the legislative session as saying, you know, DCA is really not a bad agency, but every session needs a boogeyman, and we made DCA the boogeyman. Well, guess who's going to be the next boogeymen? Local governments. once they start using this newfound discretion if it crosses the wrong interests. So local governments need to organize, work with their local legislative delegations, give themselves more clout in the legislature. One thing, though, that I'm absolutely sure of, if we expect a better future, we cannot leave it in the individual hands of 475 individual local governments. We must have local governments working together in some way, or Florida is going to be lost, in my view. Again, I don't want to conclude on a pessimistic note. I think this has been a tremendous educational process that we've gone through. I think we can learn from it. There are lessons there for us. And as I said at the beginning, I remain undaunted. I think that through planning and law, we can improve the human condition and we can make Florida better. And as planners, we simply can't give up. We have to keep on working. Thank you again for this opportunity. Over there. Okay.
All right, well, I'm not sure what to say. Doesn't happen very often. All right, we have limited time. I didn't want to interrupt Mr. Pelham, so we'll open the floor to questions. And if there is no questions, we have a question online for the first time, or a second time. Can you say what the question is?
It's a question from Melissa Saunders, and her question is there a way to reconstitute regional planning from a grassroots perspective, especially in rural areas where capacity is limited and resources are precious?
Go ahead.
Well, I would hope so. And my remarks about regionalism should not be taken as a commentary, negative or positive, on our existing regional planning framework. You know, a part of the plate that we have before us now is the long history of our regional planning councils. But because of that, like DCA, they also carry lots of baggage. But there are areas of this state that are dependent upon the assistance, the resources that planning councils have offered. That is particularly true in our rural areas, some very important rural areas. And one of the sad things about what has happened is that the ability of even our regional planning councils to address that issues have been greatly handicapped because the governor vetoed all of their funding, state funding. So we have to find a way. Those areas do need assistance.
I would add to that a slightly different perspective. I mean, it's not inconsistent. My perspective is that we need to demonstrate that a regional planning initiative is good for all segments of our community. And the easiest place to do that is in a metropolitan area like South Florida. I look at the legislative session and I see a lot of rural fingerprints I see a lot of footprints up your back that came from the rural part of and the tail was wagging the dog in many ways. But just take the Palm Beach, Broward-Dade and Monroe County region, we confront really major issues, and not the least of which is how are we going to be effective in a global economy? And we don't have a strategy. We have 115 different plans run by 115 different captains and crews, and our possibility of really playing a meaningful role. I asked David earlier how many people he thinks live in South America, and he said, I don't know, 50 million. Then he said, no, that can't be right. There's 60 million in Brazil. There are 356 million people in South America, one of the largest untapped economic markets in the world. And here we are, the most proximate area, and you pick up all the plans in these counties, and you don't see anything about how do we create an economic vision where we can sustain it. Where is the plan about educational tourism? Where is healthcare tourism? It's just not there. So I think that a ground up is possible, but I don't see it coming from local governments. Like your skepticism about the state and the legislature, which I share, I think our local governments have a really hard time stepping back from the day-to-day activity, particularly in this budget. So I think there are other interests that we need to look at, and that grassroots, and as Tom, I think, knows, and Yap knows for sure, I mean, Bob Yarrow is coming here. I am a great plan of the New York Plan Association and Regional Plan Association, and I think non-traditional sponsors of plans for a region. It doesn't have to be a complete comprehensive plan, but it could look at the strategic needs of this region, look at the economy, even creating an idea of how we're going to participate in the global economy. A lot of people could suddenly say, well, I know how to fit into that. That could be the framework. So I'm an optimist, but I don't think we're going to see it coming from the legislature, and I don't think it's going to come from getting together those 110 local governments that we have to, and getting them in a room and getting them to say, yeah, is difficult enough. But then to say, start dividing who's going to get what part of the pie. So I think those kinds of visions and ideas, those aspirational things that a plan ought to have as a starting point. It doesn't, and I'm not talking about a plan that fits into the state's regulatory plans. It's a vision of what we want to be when we grow up. And we got to grow up in a hurry. I mean, Tom and I absolutely agree. I mean, we have a window of opportunity. That million units that are out there stifling the economy have given us an opportunity to take a deep breath and think about our future. And that's not what's happening in local government after local government.
A question for Mr. Pelham. You went through some detail about the policy and institutional limitations and the accretive subtractions of powers at the regional level and so forth. One of the other elements was the infrastructure trust fund. Could you comment on the importance of that, the loss of that funding source that was the other half of the 85 Act, and do you have any suggestions for its current replacement?
Well, obviously it's exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing. I mean, how do you revive an economy, much less achieve and maintain a growing economy, without investment in your state? Especially without investment in fundamental, essential infrastructure. And to raid the infrastructure trust fund in order to avoid facing up to other responsibilities that require funding is simply no way to stimulate economic development in our state. And what the legislature has been doing, not just with regard to the infrastructure trust fund, is raiding all manner of other trust funds that were created to address specific problems, i.e., e.g., affordable housing, for example. I think there's going to have to be a fundamental change in the stance and attitude of the legislature before we get past this kind of thing.
Yep, I want to kick in here. I think one of the fundamental failings of our planning initiatives over the 30 years is that it did not have an element that educated the general public about the reality of the connectedness of our economy and our investment in the future. And so when I talk to people about positions they take and who they support, they don't have a clue. And transportation is a great example. Everybody believes that it's all those other people on the road that cause the congestion. And they don't understand, they don't take into account when they make a housing decision what the implications for their society are. In our community with Boca Raton, where I live part-time, we've had a massive relocation of employees. We had about 62% of the jobs in Boca lived in Boca in about 1970. It's now down under 40% and moving. The average employee moved 19 miles away from the city of Boca Raton when they made a decision to just detach themselves from a close in place near their place of employment. Guess where the congestion came from? It wasn't new growth and development. It was people making a housing choice because there wasn't housing for worker bees in our city, and that is compounded. If we have to do a better job of translating. I said in the class this summer, we've got to stop planning for planners. We have to plan for our community and make sure, because if they don't understand it, they're not going to support it. If they don't understand it, they're not going to demand that their legislators And I think that's a fundamental problem. And that, I mean, most people in the South Florida don't know who the major consumers of water are. Drainage was until recently the biggest consumer of potable water in South Florida. Is the water we pump into the Atlantic Ocean, into the Gulf of Mexico in order to keep the land dry. And it's just, you know, and there's a classic example of a choice. A choice was made to drain the land in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. When I grew up, it was the South Florida Flood Control District. It's now the Water Management District. That was its patronage. And so people need to understand that so they can make their choices.
This is a question for both of you. Your narrative basically showed that there is a power struggle, and you mentioned it right away. And planners were trained that we have to pay attention to power, but be apolitical, be rational. The lesson learned for me here is that planners must be political. And now we're faced with the question, how are we going to be political? So developers have their power alliance. You were actually told that there are forces out there that get you when they act, you're not going to know. I see Florida has a lot of opportunity. There are community-based organizations, there are naturalist organizations, environmental protection movements, there's people that protect turtles and dolphins. Is this an opportunity for planners to now to be openly political and align themselves with these forces and say, listen, community-based organizations, Sierra Club or whatever, we can plan with you for a vision for a region to protect our natural resources, our people, our environment, our economy?
Well, it is hard to do rational planning in an irrational political environment, first of all. And we all have to be concerned about survival, our own individual survival as well as the community and the states. I'm not going to advise public sector planners that they should become openly political. It would be a great sacrifice to make if one wants to make that judgment. But aside from the question of whether that's the way planners, and especially public sector planners, should go, I think there is great opportunity and a need for doing what you're suggesting. I think we do need now more than ever a greater public awareness on the kinds of issues that Charlie just talked about, but in general. And citizen involvement and awareness is more important now than ever. Because one of the things, for example, that this new legislation does is to just stick a dagger in the back of the citizen. The rules are all rigged against any kind of meaningful challenge. So yes, I see the issue. I think there's a need for that. Public sector planners better be careful in this environment.
I mean, my vision is that there is a governmental planning structure marginalized now, and it's going to take a long time for it to recover. And I don't believe we have time as planners to wait. But I think that instead of becoming political, actually I would encourage or suggest we consider becoming apolitical and to do as the Regional Plan Association in New York does, and some other organizations, the Chicago Business Club did in 1905 and 6, is aspire to what it takes to be a great region, if we did South Florida as a demonstration, not as the basis for a regulatory instrument, but for identifying the ideas and then identifying that people are important and that people can be part of implementation. If we persuaded everybody in this region, or 30% or 40% of the people in this region, to making housing location decision on a comprehensive basis, looking at the mobility implications, looking at the transportation costs, looking at the air quality implications, if they would just take that into account when they make a decision, you could have a profound impact on this region's long term. But we don't provide that to them. There's no basis where they can look to it. Even the environmental organizations are active. So I would actually suggest that planners can play a very meaningful role. They need an institutional framework that's not the government, it's not controlled by the legislature. And the power of an idea over time can build. It'll take 10 years, 15 years, it might. but I'm convinced that looking to a governmental legislative solution to the problems we have today is at least 20 years away, if not more. And so that's why I think that we've been through advocacy planning in my career. It got our heads chopped off in many states, and what happened in Florida at least got passed in law. I was involved in a number of initiatives in other states where it never even became law because planners as advocates were not very successful in competing with the political resources of other interests.
So one of the most interesting things that you said, Tom, was that according to you, a plan has to have the power of law. At the same time, I'm hearing Charlie speak and I'm hearing myself talk about it's really more about convincing and letting people see what choices they're making. So how do we do this?
Well, I think there's room for both views, and I think it depends in part on what planning and what plan you're talking about. You can have an aspirational plan that motivates governments and people to action. But if you're talking about planning in the context of here is the goal that we as the state or local government feel we must achieve, leaving it as an aspiration is probably, in my view, going to be disappointing. I don't think that the plan is law approach or the paradigm is perfect in all ways, but I think that without the force of law, our planning process would have evaporated long before now. But I think there's always room. I mean, let's go to my region in Orlando. Don't take my remarks as an endorsement of it or condemnation. It's a outside governmental structure, but it involves governmental officials. It's built up quite a bit of momentum. They've been able to persuade local governments to give it force of law by incorporating it into their comp plans, but it started as an aspirational kind of thing that didn't have the status of law.
And I agree. I mean, I'm focused myself on changing the paradigm. And changing the paradigm is right now the aspirational aspects of and the collective interests that were the foundation of the Planning Acts is now been demolished by the legislature, and it's not likely to come back. It will come back in initiatives like the one in Orlando, and I believe that there are opportunities to build that aspirational. I think in the context of that aspiration, then the local governments can do the kinds of things with the involvement of citizens who now understand the consequences of their own actions, et cetera, to get together and start the local governments building ground up. But I think they're going to have a hard time if doing that without the aspirational planning context created by some authority, whether it's the Regional Plan Association or some other institutional interest that has the resources and interest to take a leadership role in what should be. Not making it happen, but create a context of what could happen, and so I think there is room for both. I think that it's going to be very difficult for local governments to get there by themselves anytime soon.
Yeah, I would say add a local plan as law will have a hard time surviving if it doesn't have the necessary support and is not in sync with the aspirations of the people that it purports to apply to.
All right, so final question.
Thank you for coming to FAU, Mr. Secretary. 30 years ago, I left New York to come to Florida, and I called it paradise. 20 years ago, either the Time magazine or Florida Trend had a front cover, and the question was, is paradise lost? After hearing you speak today, and after being part of the development machine myself for the last 20 years, is paradise lost in Florida? Are we trying to save it? Are we past that point? I mean, we have our beaches, we have our waters, we have our tourism industry, but after seeing what has happened, I just don't know if we've gone beyond the point of no return, where now we're just nothing more than New Jersey with palm trees. But can we still save Florida, or the image that many of us had when we first got here?
Well, I concluded by saying that I think planners have to remain optimistic, undaunted, with an eye to the future. And I think Florida still has within it the ability to be a great state with great regions, great regional communities. I think the potential is there in a number of places. But I think a vision that says the perfect society is the one in which there are no regulations, that we should leave everything up to individual local governments in their wisdom, because they have all the wisdom, is the model that we should aspire to. And it's just, it's shocking to me that we would have learned so little. And so, yeah, I certainly have great concern about where Florida is headed, especially if it continues to pursue that paradigm. But I still think that there's enormous potential in this state if we can only realize it. But to me, that requires government, citizens, private sector, and public sector working together to achieve a common objective, and a vision that says government is evil, and our top priority should be to eliminate as much of government as we can, is a short-sighted vision that will lead us down the wrong road.
Peter, I would say that Florida has changed, and I've been around here for a long time. And I think many things are not as they once were, but I don't think paradise is lost. But it's got to be put on a stable path pretty soon, or we will, I think we very much are at risk, because our economy over the last 30 years has primarily been based on converting raw land to develop product which we've sold to visitors. And tourism, while it is strong, has been primarily directed at selling real estate. That's the model that we've had. And I see South Florida, I see Florida as a whole rapidly becoming like the Colorado mine town. It was founded around a gold vein, a silver vein or a gold mine. And we've been mining that raw land. Well, we're about done. There's not much of it left. And we better find an economy. And if we can find that economy, if we can look south, if we can look at the goods and services, we can make it easy for high-tech businesses to move to South Florida, because we have a strategy. If we improve our schools, if we, and I think paradise is not lost. But if we continue to treat public monies, and when they're used, as expenditures instead of investments, paradise may well be lost. Because if we don't start investing in our future in time and money and ideas, I believe we're at great risk.
All right. Thank you so much for being here, Secretary Pelham. Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Tom.
Pleasure.